the perfect wife. Emily Carter was, by all outward appearances, the embodiment of the American dream, a graceful woman in her early 40s whose calm presence seemed to anchor the lives of those around her. She lived in a sprawling colonial-style home on a tree-lined street in suburban Connecticut with her husband Jack, a financial consultant with an impeccable reputation, and their 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. Their life, to anyone looking in from the outside, was one most people aspired to, but few attained. Stable, prosperous, harmonious. Emily's days unfolded with the seamless regularity of a finely tuned clock. Mornings began before sunrise, her feet softly padding across the polished wooden floors to wake Sophie for school. She prepared breakfast, blueberry pancakes for Sophie, black coffee for Jack, while listening to the gentle hum of NPR on the kitchen radio. After sending Sophie off on the school bus and Jack off to work, Emily would take a moment to savor the quiet sunlight filtering in through the tall windows before turning to her own pursuits. Though Emily had paused her career as a journalist after Sophie was born, she was anything but idle. She volunteered on the PTA board, organized charity events for the local hospital, and was always the first to deliver a casserole or a bouquet to a neighbor in need. Her friends often marveled at her energy, her meticulous attention to detail, and her unwavering poise under pressure. To outsiders, Jack and Emily were the perfect couple. They enjoyed dinners at elegant restaurants on Friday nights, long walks in the park on Sunday afternoons. Their marriage, after nearly 15 years, appeared to have weathered the storms that so often battered other couples. Jack, with his affable smile and dry wit, was attentive and affectionate in public, never missing an anniversary or forgetting to leave notes of encouragement for Emily on the kitchen counter. They traveled as a family every summer: Paris, Maui, Lake Tahoe, collecting memories and photographs for Christmas cards that featured coordinated outfits and radiant smiles. Within their immaculate home, everything had its place. Jack's home office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather-bound books. Emily's garden was a riot of carefully curated blooms. Family portraits lined the staircase, chronicling every milestone, a timeline of apparent perfection. But pristine surfaces and curated routines, while comforting, sometimes hid the quiet anxieties Emily carried within. She prided herself on reliability, yet occasionally felt a vague sense of displacement. Her friendships, though warm, seldom probed beneath the cheerful surface. With Jack so often traveling for work, she grew accustomed to a certain solitude, one she filled with volunteering, reading, planning, and parenting. Still, Emily brushed these worries aside. Every night, as she tucked Sophie into bed and listened to the even rhythm of Jack's breathing, she told herself she was content. She convinced herself that the faint undercurrent of uncertainty, a fleeting look from Jack, a change in the cadence of his laughter, the subtle way he glanced at his phone, was nothing more than the product of an overactive mind. In the golden glow of evening, with the house quiet and the world outside dissolving into darkness, Emily allowed herself a private, hopeful conviction. She was not only a good wife and mother, she was, in her own way, as perfect as she could reasonably hope to be. She had no way of knowing how quickly that illusion was about to unravel the veil of secrets. The days following Jack's funeral unfolded in a blur of condolences, casseroles, and legal paperwork. Emily found herself moving through each motion on autopilot, her mind cocooned in a numb haze. Friends came and went, filling her home with the hushed rituals of mourning, awkward silences, tearful embraces, the clinking of plates on the granite countertop. Through it all, Emily performed the role of the grieving widow with the same studied composure that had defined her life. Only in the stillness of the late nights, when Sophie lay sleeping and the house was shrouded in darkness, did Emily allow herself to unravel. She would sit alone at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling chamomile tea, replaying memories of Jack's laughter, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallways, the warmth of his hand in hers. In those quiet moments, a pang of loneliness gripped her heart with a fierceness that left her breathless. But grief, she discovered, was not the only visitor in her new reality. In the weeks that followed, as she took on the unfamiliar mantle of widowhood, Emily was confronted with a host of practical challenges she had never fully considered. There were bank accounts to update, insurance forms to fill, the will to locate and review. Jack had always managed the family's finances, leaving Emily only on the periphery of their financial world, a peripheral role she accepted without question, basking in his reassurances of stability and security. Now, as Emily sorted through drawers crammed with tax returns, investment statements, and envelopes postmarked across the state, she began to notice small inconsistencies. A notice for a safe deposit box at a bank she hadn't known Jack used, receipts from restaurants in cities Jack had supposedly never visited, an account statement from an unfamiliar credit union. Addressed not to Jack Carter, but to J.D. Carter. A diminutive Emily had never heard spoken aloud. Curiosity bloomed, subtle at first, then persistent. She found herself wondering about the gentle evasions Jack had given over the years. Postponed explanations, vague comments about work trips that overlapped with family events. Had she been naive or simply trusting? Emily could not shake a growing feeling that something important had been hidden from her view, layered beneath years of routine and trust. The questions deepened with each passing day. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed in careful handwriting to Mr. Carter, but clearly postmarked after Jack's death. Inside was an innocuous note, "Thinking of you, as always. Love, Linda." And a photograph of a small boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a swing set in a city park that Emily did not recognize. Her breath caught, fingers trembling, a chill running the length of her spine. She turned to Jack's laptop, which had lain untouched on his desk since the day he died. Hesitation warred with desperation. She ultimately found herself searching through files, emails, online accounts, seeking answers, maybe reassurance, but bracing for pain. Each browser tab, each folder opened, unraveled another thread of certainty she had clung to for so long. In the midst of all this, Emily noticed small behaviors in herself. A new vigilance, the way she studied Sophie's face for traces of unease, her tendency to double-check doors and locks at night. What if their safe and comfortable life had always been perched atop a secret? What if, in trusting Jack so implicitly, she had overlooked clues that now seemed glaring, her sleep fractured? Emily spent the next days piecing together a mosaic of fragmented evidence, travel itineraries, that included an unexpected detour to Providence, Rhode Island, a flurry of text messages from a number saved in Jack's phone as L, wire transfers to an account she could not easily trace. The sense of unreality grew with each new discovery, as if she were slipping through a trapdoor beneath the carefully painted floors of her own life. There were moments when Emily tried to banish these suspicions, chiding herself for letting paranoia take root in the aftermath of grief. But the evidence was undeniable, their weight impossible to ignore. She spoke little of these discoveries to friends or family, afraid of confirming her fears out loud. It was during one of her solitary searches, late at night, hunched over the glow of a screen, that Emily realized her role was shifting. No longer the perfect wife in a storybook marriage, she was now something else, an investigator in her own home, a woman determined to lift every veil, no matter how much it might hurt. As she typed in password combinations, Jack's birthday, Sophie's middle name, their wedding anniversary, Emily braced herself for answers she knew would change everything. The perfect life, she now understood, had always been just a surface. And beneath the surface, secrets multiplied in the shadows, waiting for their day in the light, the second family. The truth, when it finally revealed itself to Emily, did not arrive with a cinematic crash. Instead, it took shape slowly, a shadow growing sharper. With every piece of evidence she painstakingly assembled, Emily, once the picture of composure, was now sustained by restless energy and gnawing sense of betrayal. There was a painful intimacy in tracing the architecture of Jack's secret life. With each new discovery, it felt as though she were dismantling their marriage brick by brick. The email trail had been the most damning. Buried beneath layers of innocent correspondence and work updates, a folder named simply Family stood out. Emily hovered over it for what felt like hours before gathering the courage to click. What she found inside changed her world forever. There were photos, candid snapshots of Jack with a boy whose face she had never seen, laughter frozen in time at playgrounds and ice cream shops. Standing beside them was a woman, tall and elegant, her dark hair cut into a sleek bob. She appeared in photo after photo, sometimes with her hand resting lightly on Jack's shoulder, sometimes laughing at something out of view. A quick search through electronic records would later confirm her name, Linda Callahan. Emily's hands shook as she scrolled through the files, her mind trying and failing to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the man who existed in these digital fragments. There were birthdays celebrated, Halloween costumes, even homemade holiday cards signed with Love Jack, Linda, and David. David, as Emily soon learned, was Jack's other child, a son, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with Jack's unmistakable smile and Linda's intense eyes. No single moment encapsulated the shock that Emily felt. The realization settled into her bones like an ache that would not fade. She moved through their Connecticut house in a daze, her every movement haunted by questions. Had Jack loved them less? Was it ever truly love at all? The smallest details tormented her. A jacket she never recognized in the back of Jack's closet. Phone calls abruptly ended when she entered the room. Mysterious business trips that now reeked of deception. Worse than the pain was the unbearable sense of displacement. Emily realized that somewhere, mere miles away, In another tidy neighborhood, Linda had been living her own version of the perfect wife story. Linda, too, had seen Jack off in the mornings, tucked David into bed at night, and maybe even listened to the same lies about late meetings and canceled flights. The bitterness settled in as Emily pictured Jack performing fatherly rituals for two families, two separate lives, skillfully balanced on the edge of disaster. The need for answers morphed quickly into a need for confrontation. Emily's sense of betrayal was eclipsed only by the urgency to see Linda face to face, to look into the eyes of the woman who had, knowingly or unknowingly, shared her husband. She rehearsed conversations in her head, imagining questions she would demand. Had Linda known about Emily and Sophie? Did she understand the destruction their secret love caused? Was she a victim, a conspirator, or both? But before any confrontation came the careful, methodical gathering of evidence. Emily combed through bank statements and legal documents, piecing together the flow of money Jack had funneled to support the second household. She uncovered wire transfers made every month to Linda's address, insurance policies listing David as a beneficiary, and appointment reminders masked as business lunches. It was a grim mosaic, each tile cold and irrevocable. Yet in her heart, a battle raged between devastation and determination. Emily refused to allow this betrayal to reduce her to a caricature, a jilted widow lost in bitterness. Instead, she vowed to reclaim agency, to protect her daughter, to seek truth and justice in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. For Sophie's sake, if nothing else, Emily would hold her head high. Nights became restless marathons of planning and remembrance. One evening, clutching a faded photo of her own small family, Emily whispered a silent promise. She would not let Jack's duplicity destroy the life she had built, nor let another woman's existence condemn her to invisibility. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was painfully clear. Emily would no longer be a passive observer in her own story. As dawn crept over the horizon, Emily sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by files and unanswered questions, steeling herself for what came next. The time for unearthing secrets was over. The time for confrontation, raw, painful, and necessary, had finally arrived. Confrontation. Emily Carter had always believed that pain peaked and then faded, the way a wave rises before breaking on the shore and retreating into memory. But she underestimated the sharp new ache that came as dread turned into action. In the days after discovering the secret family, her hands moved with robotic precision, making breakfast, folding clothes, smiling for Sophie, while her mind simmered with a singular mission: to face Linda Callahan and seek the truth, no matter how much it hurt. She arranged the meeting with calculated care. A neutral ground, an unremarkable cafe on the edge of a nondescript shopping plaza, halfway between her home and the address she'd traced to Linda. She chose the early afternoon when the place would be quiet, filled only with the soft clinking of coffee cups and the occasional murmur of strangers. The day before, Emily barely slept, rehearsing what she might say, turning phrases over in her mind. Accusations, confessions, pleas for understanding, warnings. The weather matched her mood, gray, close, on the verge of rain. Emily arrived first, her heart thundering, palms slick with nervousness. She sat at a corner table, facing the door, and ordered a black coffee she knew she wouldn't touch. Every sound, footsteps, the whir of milk frothing, the laughter of a pair of teenagers outside, made her tense. Linda entered 10 minutes late. Emily recognized her instantly. The dark hair, clipped neat, the measured stride of someone used to hiding tension beneath. Control. She wore dark jeans and a navy blouse, blending in with the other midday patrons. They locked eyes, both women wearing identical expressions, wary, strained, prepared for battle. Neither offered a handshake. Linda sat across from Emily, laying her bag on her lap, shoulders squared, silence pressed between them, broken only by the distant hiss of the espresso machine. Emily noticed Linda's hands, nails impeccably trimmed, fingers twisting a thin gold ring. Tiny details she wished she'd never noticed in the family photos. Emily spoke first. "Thank you for coming." Linda watched her, expression unreadable. "I figured we'd have to do this at some point." The simplicity of it, the acknowledgement that both their lives had been living toward this collision, stripped away the small pleasantries Emily had rehearsed. Rage, sadness, and a wounded curiosity vied for dominance. "I suppose there's no way for this to be anything but awful," Emily said, her voice low, trembling with restrained emotion. "I just need to know, how long did you know about me?" Linda's jaw tensed. She hesitated, measuring her words. "I've known about you for a while, but Jack was always careful about how much he told me. I didn't know the details. I only found out you existed when David was about 5 and Jack started missing birthdays. That's when he admitted he was married." The confession landed heavy, but Emily sensed evasion at its edges. "And that was enough for you? Being the secret, the other woman?" Linda's eyes flashed, but she remained composed. "Don't pretend he was just your husband. He sold both of us stories, promised he'd leave you, that he'd start over with me and David. You know how easily he lied." Emily stared at her, anger and heartbreak twisting inside. "Easy for him. But what about you, Linda? You had a choice." Linda's expression hardened. When you're raising a child alone, and a man is giving you everything, support, security, love, you stop caring about what's right. "I did what I had to for my son." The words shoved Emily further to the edge, a cold realization blooming. She and Linda weren't so different, both desperate to preserve their families, both used, both left behind by Jack's grand manipulations. The conversation tilted dangerous. "Do you know," Emily said slowly, "that while you were living your secret life, mine was built on his lies? Sophie worshipped her father. He was our world, and I thought I was his." Linda shrugged, her detachment finely honed. "I thought that too sometimes. But in the end, we were both stories he told to make himself feel like a hero." Emily's throat tightened as Linda leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the world outside into grayscale uncertainty. They sat in silence, both women recognizing a mirrored pain. Emily reached for control. "So why did you agree to meet? What do you want?" Linda's response was immediate, practiced. "I want what's fair for David. Jack cared about him. He left things for us." She paused, watching Emily for any crack in her resolve. "You don't have to be our enemy." Emily shook her head. "He left confusion and debt and a mess that I have to untangle. The will. Did he promise you something he couldn't give?" Linda's composure faltered, bitterness seeping through. He named David as a beneficiary on insurance. He said he'd make us safe if anything ever happened. Seems I was naive to believe in any of it. A surge of cold determination rose in Emily. If there's a legal claim, we'll settle it in court. But don't come for my daughter's future. Linda's gaze sharpened. I'm not the only one who will fight for what's mine. The threat hung between them, a warning not just about money, but about dignity, the right to a history, the right to survive the storm Jack's lies had unleashed. Somewhere in the back of the cafe, a barista dropped a plate. The clatter jolted Emily back. She looked at Linda, a woman not so different from herself, battered by love, pride, and betrayal, clawing for a place in the wreckage Jack had left. She felt exhaustion crash over her, but stood her ground. This ends with us, Linda. No more secrets, no more shadows, for all our children's sakes. Linda hesitated, something like sorrow flickering in her eyes. You never really know a person, do you? Emily managed a brittle smile. No, but we can decide who will be without him. Linda stood, closing her bag and gathering herself with a grace that bordered on defiance. She paused, searching Emily's face as if for a sign of surrender, then walked away into the gray afternoon. Emily sat for a while longer, watching the rain wash the world clean. She was no longer just the perfect wife or the grieving widow. She was a survivor on a newly drawn battlefield. The confrontation had not ended anything, but had traced the contours of the fight ahead. A battle for truth, for legacy, and for the right to reclaim her own life. When Emily finally left the cafe, she did so with her back straight, her grief sharpened into resolve. She owed it to Sophie and to herself to see this through the margins of her own story. For weeks after the confrontation, Emily moved through her own life as if she were visiting someone else's dream. Familiar rooms, the scent of lavender laundry detergent, the distant hum of Sophie's favorite cartoon drifting from upstairs. The world she had so carefully preserved felt suddenly off-kilter, as if she were peering through glass into a home that looked like hers, but belonged to a stranger. The shock of Jack's deception left a residue that seeped into every waking moment. Before it had been grief, now it was a sort of exile. She was still the legal wife on paper, but the narrative swirling through her social circles and even among some relatives began to shift. Subtle, insidious. At PA meetings, old friends who once basked in her seeming perfection now offered her sympathetic glances, but their eyes slid away too quickly. Some exchanged whispered remarks when they thought she was out of earshot, the tone not entirely unkind, but tinged with fascination and judgment. Rumors moved swiftly in their quiet Connecticut suburb. Bits of Jack's story, half-truths he'd spun to Linda or to other acquaintances, somehow leaked into conversation. There were people who wondered aloud if Emily had been a cold wife, if Jack had strayed because something was missing at home, if the other woman was perhaps more victim than villain. No one stated these things outright, but the implication hung in the way neighbors drew their children closer, or the way her brother-in-law hesitated before offering help. What hurt Emily most weren't the outright betrayals, but the little mismatches of loyalty. A few family members, Jack's distant cousins, an aunt who'd always favored drama, openly sympathized with Linda's situation, seeing in her single motherhood a tragic courage. She must have adored him too, Emily heard one relative murmur at the wake. And the boy, well, the boy didn't ask for any of this, did he? Emily didn't begrudge David's innocence, but she was stung by how quickly people seemed to find a tragic heroine in Linda, while Emily herself faded into a character marked by restraint, perhaps even blame. With Jack gone, Emily felt adrift on the margins of every gathering. Lawyers' offices, once intimidating, became a routine destination. Each meeting began with polite condolences, followed by cool, clinical discussions about titles, trusts, and contested claims. The warm, human rituals that had once grounded her, baking cookies for a school fundraiser, greeting neighbors out front with a wave, now felt performative, hollow. She moved through daily rituals out of obligation and necessity, rarely out of joy. At home, Emily found herself scrutinizing phantom traces, as if searching for affirmation that her life had truly happened as she remembered. She would run her fingers along the family photos that lined the staircase, pausing at Sophie's 4th birthday, the year their backyard had been transformed into a menagerie of balloons and laughter. Now, those same snapshots felt like artifacts from a civilization lost to an unforgiving ocean. She wondered if any of it had ever been solid, if she had imagined the love in Jack's gaze, or if she'd fallen for a beautifully crafted story. Sophie became her anchor, even as Emily struggled to explain the shifting shape of their family. The questions her daughter asked, why Daddy wasn't coming home, why people from school whispered, why Emily seemed sad even on sunny mornings, forced Emily to search for language that could build a bridge between heartbreak and hope. She told Sophie that families could be complicated, but that they were still a family. Sometimes, when Sophie slept, Emily wept quietly, mourning both the past and a future that would never be what she'd planned. In the loneliest hours, after the dishwasher cycle ended and the house fell still, Emily let herself relive the confrontation with Linda and all that had followed. She replayed the sharp edges of their conversation, dissecting each word and shadow. Was it enough to be right? She wondered. If everyone else insisted on rewriting the story without her as the protagonist? Was she merely an afterthought in a drama that no longer belonged to her? She tried to confide in a friend, only to sense polite impatience and the awkward scramble for platitudes. At least you have Sophie, at least you have the house, as if grief and humiliation could be measured in square footage, or the steadfastness of a child's embrace. Emily smiled and said she was fine. She began seeking solace in places she'd neglected for years. The public library grew familiar again. Its quiet order was a balm to her scattered mind. She checked out memoirs from women who had survived public scandal or private heartbreak, searching for stories of survival, for blueprints of reinvention. In their pages, she found kinship, and a reminder that tidy lives are often just tidy on the surface. Some evenings, she drove her old sedan to the edge of town, parking near the river where the town's lights shimmered on gentle currents. There, she allowed herself to remember other versions of herself: newlywed, new mother, diligent volunteer, before the world grew so fractured. These moments in solitude were the only times she could truly feel the scope of her anger and sorrow without edit or apology. The sense of being an outsider looking in gradually gave way to something else. As weeks passed, a kind of clarity crept in through the cracks. Emily no longer tried so hard to control what others thought or said. She couldn't rewrite the past, and she couldn't compete for sympathy in stories that would inevitably position her as either a stoic victim or an obstacle to someone else's tragedy. She began to realize that reclaiming her dignity did not depend on the court of public opinion, but on her own willingness to re enter her life fully on her own terms. As she learned to ignore the sideways glances at the grocery store, Emily started tending her neglected garden again, digging her hands into the cool earth, cutting back winter's dead stems, coaxing new growth from beneath the ruined beds. In this small act of renewal, she found a metaphor for her struggle. Nothing beautiful endured without heartbreak, and nothing true survived without being claimed. It would be a long road, she knew, filled with legal battles and awkward encounters, with wounds that stubbornly refused to heal overnight. But Emily was determined not to remain a ghost in her own house, or a footnote in Jack's unraveling story. She would find her way back. Not to the old narrative, but to a new one, forged in pain, but rooted in truth. And if that meant standing on the margins for a while, watching as those who didn't understand spun tales in which she barely appeared, that was a price she knew she could bear. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe that being pushed to the periphery might just be the open space she needed to grow into someone entirely new. Quiet retaliation. The world settled into a chilly equilibrium after the initial storms of grief and confrontation, but Emily Carter knew the peace in her life was an illusion. Underneath the veneer of polite condolences, tense legal meetings, and whispered neighborhood gossip, a different current began to guide her days. A current defined by resolve, vigilance, and a quiet, deliberate retaliation. Emily had never thought of herself as a fighter. Her strengths, for years, lay in soft skills: diplomacy at PO meetings, patience with Sophie's outbursts, the grace to soothe a tense dinner or mask private hurt. But now, all those understated skills became survival tools, a toolkit for battle. For what loomed before her wasn't just a matter of emotional endurance. It was the cold, complicated war of inheritance, reputation, and the quest to salvage a future for herself and her daughter. The paper trail. By now, Emily's days had acquired a new rhythm. After Sophie left for school, and before the tasks of daily living intruded, Emily transformed her dining room into a makeshift command center. Invoices, bank statements, insurance policies, and legal memos neatly stacked in color-coded folders. She assembled information the way a meticulous journalist would build a story, fact by fact, paper by paper, hunting for patterns where others might see only chaos. The more she dug, the clearer the story became. Jack's affairs had been skillfully orchestrated to keep both families afloat, but not equally secure. He had purchased life insurance policies under different names, structured investment accounts in arcane ways, and even left a trail of cryptic notes that only now made a bitter kind of sense. There were safety deposit boxes at unfamiliar banks, recurring wire transfers to Linda's address, and evidence that David, the child of Jack's second life, had been included as a partial beneficiary on more than one instrument. Emily's skills sharpened with every discovery. She began to understand not only what had happened, but how. She saw where Jack's care had lapsed, where he'd rushed details or left vulnerable gaps. She copied every document, cross-checked signatures, flagged dates, and cataloged the timeline with a reporter's discipline and a mother's ferocity. The legal alliance. Emily knew she couldn't navigate this labyrinth alone. Swallowing her pride, she reached out to Martin Fong, a respected estate lawyer with a reputation for quiet aggression and impeccable ethics. They met in his book-lined office, her folders in tow, and quickly established a partnership. Martin admired her organization and her clear understanding of the stakes. This wasn't only about property or money, but about Sophie's stability, Emily's dignity, and the right to reclaim a sense of agency. The legal battle brewed slowly. Martin drafted letters to Jack's former employers, requesting detailed benefit statements. He filed motions to freeze contentious accounts and sought court orders to examine the validity and structure of each policy Jack had ever taken out. Together, they pored over witness statements, contacted bank managers, and even hired a private investigator to verify certain financial details only hinted at in Jack's records. Martin explained that in the eyes of the law, Emily, as the legal spouse, had a superior claim to the estate and insurance benefits. Linda's position was foggy. While her child might have some rights, Linda's years as the hidden half of a secret family placed her claims on uncertain ground. Subtle counter moves. Emily soon realized her fight would not remain in the tidy boundary of legal filings. Linda, battle-hardened from years of survival, countered every advance with her own tactics. Letters from Linda's attorney began to arrive, first cautiously worded, then increasingly bold. They demanded recognition of David's status, asserted emotional hardship, and painted a portrait of single motherhood that sought both sympathy and leverage. Emily read each letter with trembling hands, but she did not waver. She refused to be drawn into hostile confrontation. Instead, she insisted on a paper trail for every interaction and communicated only through Martin. Whenever possible, she shielded Sophie from the tension, protecting her daughter from whispers and speculation. In the meantime, Emily made quiet overtures within the community. She met with the school principal to ensure Sophie would be protected from playground rumors. She reached out discreetly to local parents, correcting misperceptions without defensiveness or drama. If Linda attempted to win public sentiment in subtle ways, an emotional post on social media, a tearful anecdote shared with a mutual acquaintance, Emily responded with measured transparency, never stooping to gossip, protecting the future. The stakes in the battle were multifaceted. Emily knew that if she lost legal ground, the financial stability she'd always prided herself on providing for Sophie could evaporate. The home they loved, Sophie's college fund, even Emily's own future, everything rested on the outcome of documents, court hearings, and interpretations of intent. But beyond the money, Emily fought for something deeper. She wanted to prove to herself and to Sophie that they could survive betrayal with integrity. That wounds might become scars, but scars could become badges, not shackles. On many nights, as paperwork sprawled across the dining table and the clock struck midnight, Doubt would creep in, memories of Jack's laughter or their family's happiest holidays assaulted her defenses. Was it possible to separate justice from vengeance? Could she fight fiercely without becoming what she despised? A person defined entirely by Jack's lies? Yet each morning she returned to her methodical campaign. She sought support in small, unlikely places, banter with the mailman who brought her registered letters, the bookstore clerk who recommended legal thrillers, a neighbor who offered counseling contacts unprompted. She drew strength from incremental victories, a favorable court ruling, a banker's respect for her tenacity, a night when Sophie laughed without reservation. Reclaiming power, Emily's quiet retaliation was not centered on destroying Linda or erasing David. A child caught undeservedly in adult heartbreak. Rather, she focused on reclaiming what should always have been hers: her narrative, her peace, her power. She resolved legal ambiguities with relentless clarity. She stood unflinching in deposition rooms where family secrets, shameful and raw, became public record. She faced down not just Linda's claims, but the painful shadows cast by her own naivete and regret. It was slow, grinding work, often invisible to those around her, but with each step, she felt herself change. Anger soothed into purpose, defensiveness matured into resolve. She stopped fearing what others might think or say. Her life, once a tightly controlled tableau, grew unpredictable, but paradoxically more honest. And though some days left her exhausted, she found that in fighting for her rights, she was also fighting for her identity. The beginning of renewal. The battle was not yet over. Final judgments, asset divisions, and the story the world would eventually settle on remained unwritten. Yet as spring crept in, Emily saw something new growing alongside her uncertainty. Tulip shoots poking through the garden beds, dust swept from forgotten corners of her home, Sophie's small hand slipping into hers as they ventured out together. These were the marks of quiet, daily victories. Emily's retaliation was never loud. It was the kind of fight waged in paperwork and patience, in hard-won boundaries, and courageous vulnerability. Though she was still learning, she sensed she would emerge on the other side irrevocably changed. Not the perfect wife, nor merely the betrayed widow, but an author of her own life at last. Power and justice. The weeks bled into months, and Emily Carter's life became a study in endurance. What had begun as a battle beneath the surface had now broken into the full light of day, its stakes no longer hidden behind closed doors or whispered rumors. In the somber halls of the courthouse, the quiet war between past and future shifted to a fierce, public struggle over power and justice. The courtroom arena. Emily never dreamed she would become so intimately acquainted with the language of litigation. Cross-examine, deposition, injunction, probate. Each word at first felt foreign, clinical, even hostile. But gradually, the courthouse became a second home, its marble floors and heavy oak doors, as familiar as the path to Sophie's school or the aisles of the local grocery store. Her partnership with Martin Fong, her shrewd and gentle attorney, deepened. At every stage, Martin prepared Emily for the procedural labyrinth and the emotional minefield she was facing. He explained that the law was a framework for fairness, designed to protect legal spouses and dependent children, but he never sugarcoated the reality. In the shadow of Jack's deceptions, nothing was guaranteed. Linda's lawyer was aggressive and theatrical, a contrast to Martin's measured determination. The arguments advanced on Linda's behalf painted her as a victim, caught in the undertow of Jack's duplicity and left to raise David with uncertain prospects. It was a compelling narrative, and for a moment, Emily felt a flicker of sympathy, but it quickly gave way to the need to defend everything she and Sophie had left. The evidence unfolds. The trial was not a single decisive event. Rather, it moved in painstaking increments. A hearing here, a conference there, miles of documentation exchanged back and forth. Emily sat through hours of testimony and cross-examination, listening as her marriage, her late husband's character, and her financial future were dissected in exacting detail. Financial records became weapons and shields. For months, Emily and Martin had cataloged every account, every shadowy transfer, every policy that bore either Sophie's or David's name. The judge pored over these, asking terse questions, taking notes without revealing opinions. Most devastating was the testimony itself. Emily was called to the stand to describe her marriage, its highs and lows, her trust, and its destruction. Linda took the stand as well, recounting her own version of Jack's promises and betrayals. For the first time, the two women heard one another's stories, not as enemies, but as fellow survivors of the same grand deception. The judge, a reserved woman in her 60s, listened with a philosopher's patience. Occasionally, her eyes would rest on Sophie or David, who remained mercifully absent from most proceedings, but became the silent center of every argument. Shifting power. For so long, Emily had been at the mercy of forces beyond her control. Her husband's lies, community whispers, legal machinations. But in the clarity of the courtroom, she began to find her footing. She spoke her truth calmly under oath. She refused to be rattled by Linda's attorney's pointed insinuations and did not hide when elements of Jack's estate or actions painted her in an unflattering light. Bit by bit, her quiet resolve became a source of power. She realized that justice was about more than technical victories. It was about telling her story fully and without shame. Emily watched as the courtroom narrative began to shift. Even Linda's lawyer, so forceful at first, softened slightly when confronted with documents Jack himself had signed, promising everything to everyone and delivering only chaos. Martin pressed the estate's case methodically. As the legal wife, Emily had senior rights over the house, the principal accounts, and Jack's life insurance policies. Linda's claim on behalf of David was not ignored, and the judge made it clear that while the boy's innocence could not be contested, the law favored the household Jack had formally recognized. Reshaping justice. As the legal battle wore on, public opinion shifted again. No longer simply the perfect wife or tragic victim, Emily became, at least in some eyes, a figure of tenacious dignity. She fielded cold shoulders at grocery stores and kind words at PTA meetings with equal composure. She stopped seeking approval and focused on her own definition of victory: security for Sophie, control over her own story, and a future that no longer revolved around Jack's betrayal. There were moments of self-doubt. At night, Emily questioned whether fighting so hard was ultimately just another trap, whether dignity was truly found in winning, or if it lay in letting go. But every morning when she saw Sophie off to school, or when she returned to her documents and legal briefs, she knew she was setting an example. That standing up for justice did not have to mean destroying others, but it absolutely meant not allowing herself to be erased. Linda, for her part, fought fiercely, but not vindictively. The two women locked eyes across the courtroom many times. Each haunted by the same pain, Emily no longer saw simply a rival. She saw someone flung to the margins by Jack's double life, fighting for her own sense of worth. It was this mutual understanding that finally smoothed the sharpest edges of their feud. When it came time to consider possible settlements, Martin proposed a quiet compromise. David would receive a modest, legally secure trust for education, enabling him to have something from the man who had failed both families, while Emily and Sophie would retain the bulk of the estate and the home that meant safety and continuity. Judgment. The judge's ruling, when it came, was neither dramatic nor cruel. She parsed the estate according to strict legal precedent. Emily and Sophie were recognized as the primary heirs. Linda's son was acknowledged with a limited benefit, enough to ensure his future was not wholly abandoned by his father's mistakes. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just a single sentence reading the terms into the chats, and the sound of the gavel marking the end. Emily felt both victorious and hollow. Justice delivered on paper meant little to the heart, and the process had cost her more than she could measure. Sleep, innocence, the last residual softness in her memory of Jack. But it also granted her something new, an undeniable sense of agency and a power that could not be undone. A new balance. As the legal dust settled, Emily began the work of rebuilding. She discovered that justice was not only a matter of distribution, but of restoration. The garden she had neglected began to bloom again. Sophie laughed more freely, no longer shadowed by the secrets of half-truths. Emily met Linda once more, on a quiet afternoon outside the courthouse, to sign the final papers. Their conversation was brief, but there was no bitterness. Only the nod of two women who had weathered the same storm and survived, knowing neither was fully to blame. For Emily, power now meant the right to her own past and the freedom to shape her future. Justice, though never perfect, had restored to her not just property and standing, but a voice. And that voice was newfound strength, a promise to herself and her daughter that their story from here on out would be written on their own terms. The aftermath. The verdict was final. With the resounding thud of the judge's gavel and the quiet shuffle of paperwork, years of carefully constructed facades and months of turmoil had reached their legal conclusion. But as Emily Carter stepped out of the courthouse, papers clutched in her trembling hands, she realized that endings in life are rarely as neat or satisfying as in stories. Outside, early summer sunlight sliced through drifting clouds, illuminating the courthouse steps and the small knots of people dispersing. There were no triumphant cheers, no cathartic weeping, only a solemn sense of release. Emily inhaled deeply and let the tension drain from her shoulders, feeling not victorious, but lighter, emptied out, and ready at last to begin again. Adjusting to a new reality, returning home, the house felt at once familiar and alien. The halls bore the same echo. The kitchen window still framed the garden, and Sophie's laughter, now brighter, less brittle, spilled from her upstairs room. Yet everything had changed. Photographs of Jack now hung in gentler places, atop the mantel, beside Sophie's bed, but no longer in the central hallway, no longer as defining fixtures of their home. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself a long, uninterrupted sleep. She woke late the following morning with the rare sensation of freedom. No urgent calls from Martin, no dread of a subpoenaed conversation, no need to review evidence or mount a defense. The silence was generous, unbroken, except by the chirrups of birds and the faint clang of Sophie assembling breakfast. Emily joined her daughter at the kitchen table. "Are you okay, Mom?" Sophie asked, voice careful and earnest. "I think I will be, sweetheart," Emily replied, covering Sophie's hand with her own. "Things might feel different for a while, but we'll make something good out of what's left." Dealing with absence. Grief, Emily learned, is not a single passage, but a cycle, sometimes looser, sometimes a vice. There were days when she missed Jack fiercely, the cadence of his laugh, the smell of his aftershave, the particular way he used to say her name if he wanted her attention. But those memories were tinged with a new clarity, one that separated love from illusion. She no longer hid her mourning from Sophie. They talked openly, sometimes awkwardly, about Jack, celebrating the best of him while acknowledging the hurt. Sophie, wise beyond her years, processed her father's absence with a combination of tears, anger, and unexpected acceptance. "Do you think Daddy loved us?" Sophie asked one night, tracing idle patterns in her bedsheet. Emily considered her answer, choosing honesty over comfort. "I think in his own way, he did. But sometimes, even people who love us make choices that hurt. Our job is to remember the good, learn from the bad, and live honestly." Community and rebuilding. The world outside had its own verdicts. Some neighbors remained distant, others circled back, with cautious warmth. There was gossip, always. Rumors about money, the second family, whispered speculation about what Emily might do next. But there were also small kindnesses: a gently delivered casserole, a note left by her mailbox, the subtle smile of a fellow parent whose eyes said, "I see you." At first, Emily moved hesitantly through these social spaces, uncertain how to inhabit her new identity. No longer the perfect wife, neither villain nor martyr, she let herself become simply Emily, a woman remaking herself in the aftermath. Her garden became a metaphor for this renewal. She tore out dead roots, made space for fresh soil, planted daffodils and irises along the borders. When Sophie helped, laughter and dirt streaked their forearms, and Emily felt hope sprouting among the scarred earth. The final conversation. Before the legal case ended, Emily had encountered Linda one last time. The meeting was brisk, a few official signatures, the necessary legal exchanges. But as they parted, Linda lingered. "I hope your daughter finds peace," she said quietly. I know this wasn't your fault, and I hope the same for David, Emily replied, the years of anger softened by shared exhaustion. Maybe one day we'll be something other than rivals. Linda nodded, tears she did not let fall shining in her eyes. That final mutual recognition, more than any court order, gave Emily the balm of closure. She understood then that loss, when acknowledged honestly, could be the ground for unexpected grace. Redefining family. As weeks passed, Emily drew up new routines with Sophie. Friday nights became pancake suppers on the living room floor, stories shared by lamplight, jigsaw puzzles, completed in companionable silence. They began volunteering at a local animal shelter, making friends over the humble acts of walking dogs and feeding cats. Jack's absence, though never erased, no longer governed every decision. Instead, Emily focused on the small, daily victories. Sophie's new soccer goal, the first tomatoes ripening in the garden, the book club she tentatively joined and grew to enjoy. Holidays approached with a new rhythm. Emily and Sophie traveled to Vermont, hiked bright autumn trails, and snapped their own Christmas photos. Every tradition they kept, they amended for two, and every tradition that hurt, they quietly let fade. Looking to the future. With the estate settled, finances stabilized, Jack's last remaining insurance paid out after months of legal wrangling. Linda and David's rights were honored within the framework Emily and Martin had wrested from the chaos. A modest trust for David, dignity upheld for Sophie. There would still be paperwork, future complications, moments of uncertainty, but the foundation was sound. Emily also began to consider returning to journalism, this time for herself. The urge to write, suppressed for years by domestic obligations, returned as both an outlet and a promise to herself. She began to chronicle her experiences, not for publication at first, but for healing. Each night, she allowed herself a page, memories, confessions, hopes, her story at last in her own voice. Acceptance. On a late summer evening, as golden light danced across the kitchen walls and the air outside hummed with cicadas, Emily understood what true conclusion felt like. Not a clean break, nor sweeping transformation, but a gentle acceptance. She could grieve and rebuild in equal measure. She could miss Jack and acknowledge his betrayals, even as she moved forward. She looked at Sophie, tanned from the pool, hair tangled, freckles across her nose, and realized, with quiet certainty, that the future could be good. Emily stood in her garden, breathing the scent of new blooms and cut grass. She wasn't the person she had been, not the perfect wife, nor simply the betrayed woman. She was someone defined by survival and the will to hope. The aftermath, for all its mess and pain, was not only an ending, it was her beginning. Looking back long after the courthouse faded from memory and the garden bloomed with new certainty, Emily Carter found herself pausing to take stock of all that had come before. The drama and devastation had subsided, replaced by a quiet steadiness. But sometimes, on a crisp morning or during sleepless nights, she felt the full sweep of the years, like river stones in her pockets. Reflection, she realized, was not merely about reliving pain, but about understanding it, sifting it for wisdom, and ultimately choosing what to carry forward the landscape of loss. Emily would never claim her journey had made her invulnerable. The wounds Jack left behind, some raw, some faded to old scars, remained part of her story. She saw them in mirrors, the faint lines around her eyes, deepened by months of sleepless anxiety, in Sophie's moments of innocent sadness, even in the routines she had reassembled with such care. Yet instead of being landscapes of defeat, these marks became reminders of her endurance. She spent hours revisiting the life she once believed unassailable. There was a time when she had measured happiness in milestones, wedding anniversaries, family vacations, holiday photos lining the stairwell. It was easy then to believe in certainty, the unspoken promise that love, when tended dutifully, would offer protection against tragedy. Jack had been at the heart of every plan. In looking back, Emily grieved not only the man, but the trust so thoroughly given and, by necessity, reclaimed. Doubt, anger, and grace. There were nights when doubt clung to Emily like a second skin. She questioned her own blindness, replaying gestures and conversations that in hindsight shimmered with hidden meaning. Why hadn't she pressed harder when Jack's stories didn't add up? Why had she allowed herself to be comforted by half answers? To ignore the pulse of unease that sometimes jarred her perfect mornings? But beneath the guilt, anger simmered. Anger at Jack for his manipulations and cowardice. At Linda, though she knew their mutual pain defied simple blame. Even occasionally at Sophie, who had unwittingly become the axis around which everything spun. Yet the anger, sharp as it was, eventually softened, carved down by therapy sessions, tearful confessions to friends, and the slow realization that pain was a natural, even necessary, part of renewal. Lessons in trust, Emily learned, required both risk and forgiveness. In the shadowy aftermath, she found herself guarded, wary of strangers and lifelong acquaintances alike. She doubted intentions, scrutinized kindness for hidden motives. But as seasons turned, and life's mundane joys returned, a neighbor's dog chasing Sophie through the yard, the library's comforting hush, Emily began to open herself, if not to trust in others, then at least in her own instincts. Forgiveness, she realized, was a practice rather than a verdict. She no longer expected to wake and discover all resentment vanished. The process demanded repetition, offering herself patience after a setback, refraining from indulging old grievances, sometimes rereading Jack's letters or emails, and allowing herself a moment of nostalgia without judgment. There were days when forgiving Jack felt impossible. On others, she surprised herself by missing him, not the liar, but the companion she'd shared so much with, the father of her daughter, and architect of countless happy memories. Forgiving and moving forward. Forgiving Linda was, in some ways, easier and harder all at once. In their final meeting outside the courthouse, Emily had glimpsed not a rival, but a fellow traveler, someone forced into harsh decisions by love and necessity. It would have been easy to demonize Linda, to compete for victimhood. But with time, Emily saw the futility of comparison and the cost of bitterness. She didn't forget the pain, but she chose not to let it define the rest of her life. The truer struggle was with herself. For months, Emily had berated her own naivete, her loyalty to an illusion, her inability to prevent disaster. Gradually, through mornings in the garden and evenings with Sophie, she extended a gentleness to herself that she might offer a friend. She accepted that the Emily of the past had only done what she thought was right. The woman who emerged from the chaos was different, wiser perhaps, but also more courageous and alive to the unpredictable, unmanageable possibilities ahead. Redefining value looking back, Emily reevaluated every standard of success, love, and family she had ever held. Perfection, once her highest aim, had become a burden. She saw now how it isolated her from friends who feared their imperfections would stand in contrast, from Jack, who had hidden behind her careful routines, and even from Sophie, whose laughter was sometimes muffled by the weight of expectations. In the spaces left by loss, Emily created new value. She cherished authenticity over appearance, resilience over serenity. Her circle shrank, but her relationships deepened. Meals with friends, laced with honesty instead of pleasantries. Quiet evenings spent with Sophie that centered on listening instead of lecturing. She found unexpected joy in imperfection, in messy art projects, failed recipes, inside jokes whispered across supermarket aisles, Jack's memory, and Sophie's future. Jack's memory, unavoidably, was complex. Emily realized she did not need to choose between love and pain. She could remember his warmth and humor, and also his lies. Conversations with Sophie grew more nuanced as her daughter matured. They filled the silence with stories, both the magical and the mundane, careful not to romanticize or demonize, aiming instead for something closer to truth. Emily's hope for Sophie became clearer with each passing month. She wanted her daughter to grow up understanding that families can fracture but are rarely destroyed, that forgiveness is possible even when trust has been broken, and that worth is not measured by the absence of heartache, but by the ability to feel, hope, and recover. The power of story. In the privacy of late-night journaling and Sunday walks among wildflowers, Emily recognized the importance of telling her own story. For years, she had allowed others to narrate her life. Jack, her neighbors, even the legal system. Now she reclaimed authorship, not just with words, but with choices, boundaries, and openness to her own desires. There were still moments of longing, wishing things had turned out differently, wishing for just one more ordinary day from before. But she had learned to let those wishes drift away, replaced by gratitude for the present and curiosity about the future. Choosing what to carry looking back was not about fixing the past, but choosing what parts would come along on the next leg of her journey. Emily decided to carry forward empathy, hard-won wisdom, and the fierce love for her daughter that had never wavered. She chose not to drag regret and betrayal across every new threshold. In the gentle light of dawn, with the house still and hopeful, Emily felt something she had thought lost forever, a sense of peace. She had survived ruin, learned to forgive, and found meaning even in fragments. The past would always travel with her, but no longer as a weight. Instead, it had become the soil from which she would keep growing.